inly spilling the truth, and it's darker than you could ever imagine. Affairs, jealousy, addiction. What she's revealing will leave you stunned. Brace yourself, because this is the untold story of rock and roll's most painful love triangle. After decades of silence, Pattie Boyd is finally speaking out. And trust me, what she has to say will shock you. At 82, the legendary model and former wife of two of rock's most iconic figures, George Harrison of the Beatles and Eric Clapton, is revealing a side of the story that has remained hidden for over half a century. For years, Pattie kept quiet, letting the world imagine what her life was like. But now she's ready to share the truth, and the revelations she's about to make will leave you stunned. Pattie Boyd's name has long been synonymous with two things: iconic beauty and love. She was, after all, the muse behind some of the most beautiful and heartbreaking love songs in rock history. Songs like Layla by Eric Clapton and Something by George Harrison have immortalized her in music lore. But the story behind these songs, the real, raw, and often painful truth, has never fully been told. Until now. Her life has been intertwined with two of the most influential musicians in the world, yet her own personal story has often been overshadowed by their fame. It's easy to look at Pattie Boyd as the woman who inspired love songs, but the reality is much more complicated. For years, Pattie remained silent about her tumultuous marriages to Harrison and Clapton, living a life filled with heartbreak, public scrutiny, and personal battles. While her ex-husband's careers soared, Pattie often found herself living in their shadows, her own voice and experiences drowned out by their celebrity status. The love triangle between Pattie, George, and Eric is the stuff of rock mythology. Eric Clapton's infamous obsession with Pattie led him to write the song Layla, a declaration of love for a woman who was married to his close friend George Harrison. Clapton's desire for Pattie was so intense that it became the soundtrack to their lives. But the romance between Pattie and Clapton wasn't as idyllic as the music might suggest. Their love story was marred by jealousy, addiction, and the pressures of fame. Despite their passionate love, Clapton's demons, including his struggles with addiction, strained their relationship and ultimately led to a painful separation. But while Clapton's Layla became a rock anthem, it only tells part of the story. Pattie's side, the emotional toll it took on her, the sacrifices she made, and the silent suffering she endured, is a tale few have ever heard. For years she chose to stay silent, keeping her truth hidden behind the glossy image of a rock star's wife. She wasn't just a muse. She was a woman caught in a whirlwind of love, heartache, and personal turmoil. It wasn't just Clapton's obsession that defined Pattie's relationship with him. It was also the deep emotional connection they shared, one that was ultimately tested by time, addiction, and the pressures of being in the public eye. Despite the ups and downs, Pattie and Eric's relationship was marked by intense passion and undeniable chemistry. But it was also filled with insecurities, doubts, and jealousy, factors that would tear them apart. Now, in her 80s, Pattie Boyd has lived through the storms that come with being married to two of the greatest rock stars of all time. She's experienced the highs of fame, the lows of personal pain, and the endless struggle to define herself outside of the shadows of the men she loved. And while she has kept her silence for decades, she now feels it's time to finally share her truth, the truth that's been buried for so long. Pattie's story isn't just about her relationships with George and Eric. It's about her own journey as a woman, a mother, and an artist. It's about finding her voice in a world that often tried to silence her, about reclaiming her identity and learning to live for herself, rather than for the men who defined her in the public eye. For decades, the world saw Pattie Boyd as the beautiful, tragic figure in rock and roll's most famous love triangle. But as she finally opens up and tells her story, we're about to learn that the woman behind the songs was far more complex, resilient, and powerful than anyone ever imagined. Now, as she looks back on her extraordinary life, Pattie's words carry the weight of a lifetime of experience. Her revelations will not only shed light on the tumultuous relationships with two of music's biggest legends, but also provide a glimpse into the heart of a woman who has been through it all. And as she begins to share her truth, one thing is certain: her story is finally being heard, loud and clear. Pattie's love story with Eric Clapton is widely regarded as one of the most tragic and complicated tales in rock history. Their relationship was a whirlwind of passion, obsession, and heartache that spanned over a decade. It all began in the early 1970s when Clapton first met Pattie, a stunning model and the wife of Beatles guitarist George Harrison. Eric's infatuation with Pattie was instant, even though she was married to one of his closest friends. In fact, Clapton's love for her was so intense that it inspired one of the most iconic rock songs of all time, Layla. The song, with its heart-wrenching melody and fiery lyrics, became a symbol of Eric's obsession and longing for a woman who seemed forever out of reach. Despite their bond, Pattie's relationship with Clapton was anything but simple. The passion they shared was undeniable, but it was also tainted by jealousy, addiction, and emotional turmoil. Pattie, caught between the two most important men in her life, her husband George and her lover Eric, found herself in the middle of one of rock's most infamous love triangles. As Clapton's obsession with her deepened, so did the complications of their relationship. Pattie reflects on the early stages of their connection. Eric was incredibly passionate, and at first, I thought that was love. But looking back, I realized that it was so much more complicated. Clapton's love for her was consuming, and while it seemed romantic in its intensity, it was also deeply troubling. Pattie recalls the emotional chaos that often accompanied their connection. There was so much pain and turmoil, she admits. Eric was consumed by jealousy, addiction, and his own inner demons. He would fall into these dark places that I couldn't help him escape. I thought I could fix him, but I couldn't. The roller coaster nature of their relationship left Pattie feeling helpless. Clapton was often distant, lost in the throes of his addiction to alcohol and heroin. He would disappear for days, leaving Pattie to wonder if the man she loved would ever truly return to her. Despite his promises of love and devotion, Eric's internal struggles always seemed to overshadow the moments of joy they shared. As much as Pattie tried to support him, the relationship felt like a constant battle, one that was both emotionally and mentally draining. The infamous love triangle took on even more tension when Clapton's obsessive desire for Pattie led him to make a dramatic move. In 1974, after years of intense emotional turmoil, Clapton made his feelings for her public, leading to a scandal that rocked the music world. He had not only fallen in love with a married woman, but he had also turned his heartbreak into an anthem for the ages with Layla. The song became a declaration of unrequited love, a beautiful yet painful expression of Eric's emotional agony. The story behind Layla became a legend in its own right, but for Pattie, it was a constant reminder of the anguish she had endured. After years of personal struggles and an incredibly public divorce from George Harrison, Pattie finally married Clapton in 1979, but their marriage was far from the fairy tale it might have seemed on the surface. It wasn't what I expected, Pattie confesses. We had this intense, fiery connection, but there was always a part of Eric that was unreachable. He could be so loving one moment and so distant the next. There were times when I didn't know if I was still married to the man I fell in love with or to a ghost. Despite the years of passion and the connection they shared, Clapton's emotional baggage proved too much for their relationship to withstand. Clapton struggled with addiction, and his emotional instability took a toll on Pattie. She admits that at times she lost herself in the relationship. I was so focused on helping him, on trying to fix everything, that I forgot about myself. I put all my energy into our marriage, but it never felt like enough, she explains. The strain of Clapton's inner turmoil, combined with the constant tension and emotional pain, eventually led to the breakdown of their marriage. After 9 years, Pattie and Eric's relationship came to an end, leaving both of them devastated. The love that had once been so passionate now felt like a burden they could no longer bear. Pattie Boyd was the woman who inspired Layla, but behind the legendary song was a love story filled with obsession, betrayal, and heartbreak. For decades, she kept silent about her tumultuous marriage to Eric Clapton. But now at 82, Pattie's relationship with Eric Clapton remains one of the most poignant and heartbreaking stories in rock history. Their love was never just a simple romance. It was a saga of obsession, addiction, and emotional chaos. For Pattie, it was a journey of self-discovery and painful realization that no amount of love could fix the cracks in a relationship built on such a shaky foundation. Now, as Pattie looks back on her time with Eric, she recognizes how much she learned from their relationship. It taught me a lot about myself, about love, and about how important it is to have a healthy relationship, not just with others, but with yourself, she reflects. though the pain remains. Pattie now embraces the wisdom that came from surviving one of the most tumultuous love stories in rock history. While Eric Clapton is widely celebrated as one of the greatest guitarists of all time, Pattie Boyd offers a much more personal and revealing perspective of the man behind the music. To the world, Clapton was the epitome of musical genius, a virtuoso whose riffs and melodies defined a generation. But to Pattie, the man she once loved was often a fragile, emotionally unstable figure, haunted by the very fame and success that made him a legend. Eric's genius came at a cost, Pattie reflects, speaking with the wisdom of someone who has seen both sides of the story. The constant pressure of fame, his battle with addiction, and his emotional instability often left me feeling like I was walking on eggshells. There was this side of him that was incredibly charismatic and loving, but then there was this other side, one that was dark, unpredictable, and consumed by his own inner demons. For Pattie, being in a relationship with Clapton was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, she experienced the high of being the muse behind some of the most powerful love songs in rock history. Layla, for example, became an anthem of unrequited love, capturing the intensity of Clapton's feelings for her. But behind that passion was a darker truth. Clapton's struggles with addiction and the emotional toll that took on their relationship. Pattie opens up about the instability that defined much of their time together. He would disappear for days on end, she reveals. And I had no idea where he was or who he was with. He was gone physically and emotionally, and there were times when I felt like I didn't even know him anymore. The man I loved seemed to vanish into thin air, and I was left in the dark. This emotional distance was difficult for Pattie to understand, especially since she had never been fully prepared for the intensity of Clapton's inner battles. It wasn't just about the drugs or the alcohol, she says quietly. It was the emotional turbulence that came with it. When someone you love is so lost in their pain and addiction, it's like you become an afterthought. No matter how much you try to reach out, no matter how hard you fight for the relationship, it's never enough. In the end, you realize that the person you're trying to save is beyond saving. For Pattie, the mental strain of Clapton's addiction and emotional unavailability was often overwhelming. What started as a passionate connection soon became a source of constant anxiety and fear. I would lie awake at night wondering if he was okay, wondering where he was or who he was with, she admits. The uncertainty became a constant companion, and it ate away at my sense of self. Pattie reveals how this prolonged emotional strain led her to lose sight of her own needs. I began to lose myself in the relationship, she admits with a sense of melancholy. I put aside my own desires, my own dreams, always trying to please him, to fix him, to make things right. I thought if I loved him enough, if I gave enough of myself, he would change, that he would come back to me fully. But no matter how hard she tried, Clapton's struggles remained entrenched in their relationship, making it impossible for Pattie to reclaim her own identity. The impact on her mental health was profound. It wasn't just the drugs, the alcohol, or the late nights of worrying. It was the emotional abuse, the gaslighting, the unpredictability that wore me down, Pattie says. There were times when I couldn't even trust my own emotions, because they were constantly manipulated by the ups and downs of Eric's behavior. It made me question who I was and what I wanted. Despite her unwavering love for him, Pattie found herself slowly suffocating under the weight of Clapton's unresolved issues. The love she had for him was real, but it was tainted by the emotional chaos he brought into her life. In the end, I realized that I wasn't living for myself anymore. I was living for him, she says. I had given so much of myself to the relationship that I had nothing left for me. The toll it took on Pattie's mental health was profound, and her self-worth became tied to Clapton's behavior and emotions. She was no longer the confident, independent woman who had once been the muse for Layla and Something. She was someone who had lost herself in the whirlwind of Clapton's addiction and emotional volatility. The most painful part, she reveals, was the realization that no amount of love could heal Clapton's wounds. I kept thinking that if I loved him enough, he would change. But that's not how it works, Pattie confesses. Love isn't enough to fix someone who isn't willing to fix themselves. And eventually, I had to come to terms with the fact that I couldn't save him. This harsh realization was the turning point for Pattie. While she still loved Eric, she knew that in order to survive, she had to find a way to rebuild her life outside of the relationship. It wasn't easy and it took time, but Pattie began to reclaim herself. I learned that I could only control my own happiness. I had to let go of the idea that I could fix him or make everything okay. Once I did that, I began to find myself again, through the pain, the heartbreak, and the years of uncertainty. Pattie learned a valuable lesson. No relationship, no matter how passionate, is worth losing yourself. And though her time with Clapton left scars that would take years to heal, it ultimately helped her understand the importance of self-love and emotional independence. Pattie Boyd's life with Eric Clapton officially ended in 1988, but the emotional scars from their tumultuous relationship stayed with her long after the divorce. For years, she carried the weight of the pain and confusion that had marked the final years of their marriage. As much as she loved him, their love story was never a fairy tale, and the reality of life after Clapton was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. When the marriage ended, I was left to pick up the pieces of my life, Pattie reflects. I was no longer a wife, no longer defined by my connection to one of the world's most famous musicians. I had spent so much of my life being defined by the men I was with, that when I was on my own, I didn't know who I was anymore. Pattie's sense of self had always been intertwined with her relationships, particularly with the men who had shaped her world: George Harrison, the Beatle who had captured her heart, and Eric Clapton, the passionate and tortured soul she had tried so hard to help. When those relationships ended, Pattie found herself struggling to define her own identity outside the shadow of rock and roll. For so long I had been someone's partner, someone's muse, but when I was alone I felt lost. I didn't know how to exist outside of that world, she admits. The music world that had once been a source of excitement now felt like a cage, and the life she had known felt unfamiliar and at times unbearable. But it wasn't until later in life that Pattie began to find her way back to herself. In the aftermath of her marriage, Pattie took time to reconnect with her passions and her inner self. I needed to break free from the constant noise of the world around me. So I traveled. I went to places I had always dreamed of seeing, and I spent time away from everything I knew, she recalls. Traveling gave Pattie the space she needed to reflect on her life and to begin healing the emotional wounds that had accumulated over the years. For the first time, she began to focus on herself, on her own happiness, and on her own dreams, something she had neglected for so long. During her travels, Pattie rediscovered her love for photography. Photography became my therapy. It gave me a way to express myself without words, to capture the world in a way that was entirely my own, she says. What started as a hobby soon blossomed into a professional career, and Pattie became a celebrated photographer in her own right. Her work was praised for its intimacy, its emotional depth, and its raw honesty, qualities that reflected Pattie's own journey of self-discovery. Through her lens, she was able to capture not just the world around her, but also the emotions and experiences that had shaped her life. Photography gave her a voice when words sometimes failed. In addition to her art, Pattie found strength and grounding in her relationships with her children. Becoming a mother was the most grounding experience of my life, she shares. It gave me purpose and direction. My children became my reason for waking up every day, for finding joy again, and for creating a future that was entirely my own. Motherhood allowed Pattie to experience unconditional love in a way that helped her rediscover the love she had once lost for herself. It gave her a new sense of identity, not as the wife of a famous musician, but as a mother, an artist, and an individual. As the years passed, Pattie began to heal from the emotional wounds that had once seemed insurmountable. Through her art, her travels, and her family, she gradually learned to forgive herself and the men who had been a part of her life. I've made peace with my past, she says with a sense of quiet acceptance. The love, the loss, the mistakes, it all taught me something valuable. I wouldn't change a thing. Pattie's journey of healing was not without its challenges. There were moments when the pain of the past would resurface, reminding her of the years she had spent in toxic relationships. But through it all, she learned that forgiveness was not just about letting go of the past. It was about reclaiming her own power and her own happiness. Forgiving myself was the hardest part, Pattie admits. But once I did, I realized that the past didn't define me anymore. I was no longer that lost, broken woman who had tried to save everyone else. I had saved myself. Pattie's story is one of resilience, growth, and self-discovery. It is a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the power of self-love. She may have spent years trying to fix others, but in the end, It was her own healing and transformation that truly mattered. Today, Pattie Boyd is a woman who has come to terms with her past, embraced her present, and is looking forward to a future filled with possibilities. And as she reflects on her journey, she is at peace with who she has become. Now, at 82, Pattie Boyd is a woman who has lived through the greatest highs and the lowest lows. From the dizzying heights of fame to the crushing depths of heartbreak, she's endured it all and come out stronger on the other side. But her story isn't just about the men she loved, or the rock stars she was married to. It's about the lessons she learned, the resilience she built, and the woman she became along the way. Pattie's life could easily be seen as one of tragedy and triumph, as it's been marked by a series of emotional battles and personal victories. She was once the beautiful muse of two of the most iconic rock stars of all time, George Harrison and Eric Clapton. Yet, while her relationships with these legendary figures captured the public's attention, the true depth of her own life story was often overshadowed. But now, at the age of 82, Pattie is reclaiming her narrative and sharing the untold truths that have defined her journey. "My life has been full of unexpected twists and turns," Pattie says with a gentle smile, reflecting on a lifetime of both joy and hardship. "But I've come to realize that it's not about the fame or the heartbreaks. It's not about being married to rock stars or living in the spotlight. It's about finding your own voice and being true to yourself no matter what." For decades, Pattie was defined by her relationships with George, with Eric, and with the public image of the rock and roll world. But the fame and the glittering lifestyle weren't enough to protect her from the emotional challenges and personal turmoil that lay behind the scenes. The pressure to be the perfect wife, the perfect muse, took a toll on her sense of self. The love she shared with Eric and George was complicated, sometimes painful, and ultimately, it forced Pattie to confront the most difficult question of all. Who was she outside of the men she was married to? Outside of the world that had been created around them? "I spent so much time defining myself through my relationships, through the way others saw me, that I didn't know who I was anymore," Pattie admits. It wasn't until after the end of her marriage to Eric that Pattie began to truly understand her own worth and identity. After years of living for others, trying to fix relationships that were